A cop slaps a black woman for speaking back, shocked to learn she's the mayor. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The morning sun gleamed off the towering buildings lining the busy downtown streets. People bustled past, lost in their own worlds, clutching coffee cups, briefcases, and the remnants of hurried breakfasts. At the corner of 5th and Main, a commotion began to brew. A police officer stood rigid, his stance firm as he confronted a woman in a tailored suit, her expression composed despite the rising tension in the air. "I told you to move," the officer barked, his hand resting heavily on his belt. The woman didn't flinch. She met his gaze with an unshaken calm, her deep brown eyes steady. "And I told you I have every right to be here." The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of a growing audience. Pedestrians slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. "You don't give orders here." "I do," he snapped, his hand now gripping the strap of his vest as he took a step closer. The woman folded her arms, her tailored blazer hugging her shoulders. "That's interesting," she mused, tilting her head slightly. "Because last I checked, this was public property, and I don't answer to intimidation tactics." A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd gathering nearby. Some people took out their phones, subtly recording the scene. The officer's expression darkened. He could feel the weight of the eyes watching, feel the pressure mounting. "Enough of this," he growled. "Move, now." When the woman didn't budge, something in him snapped. In a quick, aggressive motion, he raised his hand and brought it across her face. The slap echoed through the street. A gasp shot through the onlookers, horrified and stunned. The woman staggered slightly, her hand flying to her cheek, her expression momentarily frozen in disbelief. And then silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The officer's own breath hitched, as if realizing what he had just done. He expected outrage, a screaming match, maybe even an escalation of force. Instead, the woman straightened herself, inhaled deeply, and met his gaze once again. Only this time, the quiet control in her expression had transformed into something sharper, something colder, something far more powerful. A man in the crowd muttered under his breath, "Oh, he's gonna regret that." The officer stiffened. His pulse pounded in his ears as the woman slowly turned, adjusting the lapels of her blazer with an eerie calm. Then, in a tone so measured it sent chills down his spine, she spoke. "Officer, what's your name?" The demand was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "That's none of your—" "I suggest you answer me." Her voice didn't waver, didn't raise, and yet it commanded absolute attention. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were stepping closer, their phones now fully visible, cameras pointed directly at him. The officer's face twisted in frustration. "I don't have to. You just put your hands on a civilian," she interrupted, her tone still eerily even. "You assaulted me, in broad daylight, with witnesses." She took a step forward. The officer took an unconscious step back. "And here's where things get interesting." She paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then, with the full force of her authority, she dropped the words that would haunt him forever. "I'm the mayor of this city." The world seemed to stop. The crowd let out a collective gasp. The officer's face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. The woman didn't blink. She simply stood there, watching as the realization clawed its way into his mind. She saw the exact moment he understood what he had done. His hand, the one he had so carelessly raised against her, began to shake. The crowd's murmurs turned into a low roar as people fully grasped what had just happened. The officer, now pale and visibly shaken, instinctively stepped back, as if putting distance between himself and the damage he had just done could somehow undo it. But the cameras were rolling, the witnesses were watching, and there was no taking it back. The mayor, still composed despite the sting on her cheek, exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Not when it was a painful reminder of how power was often abused, how authority was wielded recklessly, and how people like her were treated differently simply because they dared to exist in the same spaces. "You're the mayor?" The officer's voice cracked, disbelieving. His bravado was gone. She let the silence answer for her. A woman in the crowd scoffed. "He just hit the mayor." On camera, a man next to her added, "This guy's done for." The officer swallowed hard, his confidence unraveling in real time. His eyes darted around the crowd, searching for someone. Anyone who might back him up, justify his actions, give him an escape. But all he saw were raised phones, angry faces, and the undeniable weight of his own consequences. The mayor took a slow step forward. "What's your badge number?" Her voice was quiet but firm, a tone that demanded compliance, the very same way he had spoken to her just minutes ago. He hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Refusing to identify yourself is against department policy. Do you need me to remind you of your own training?" The officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed again. He licked his lips, his body stiff with panic. I didn't know that I was the mayor," she finished for him, tilting her head. "I see. So had I been just another black woman in a suit, you think this would have been acceptable?" The officer's breath hitched. He had no answer for that. Her gaze didn't waver. "Your badge number." A long beat passed before he finally rasped. 4938. "Your name." His lips barely moved. "Officer Reynolds." The mayor nodded, committing the details to memory. She turned slightly, addressing the crowd instead of him. "I want everyone here to know exactly what just happened." Officer Reynolds, a man entrusted with upholding the law, thought it was appropriate to use physical force on a civilian for simply standing her ground. "The fact that I am the mayor is irrelevant because this could have been anyone. A student, a mother, a worker on their lunch break, a person just trying to exist." She turned back to him, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds, would you have treated me the same way had I been a white man in a suit?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out, because they both knew the answer. The crowd had grown, filling the sidewalk, the tension hanging thick in the air. Some people murmured in agreement. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Then, from the back of the crowd, a deep voice rang out. "Madam Mayor." The crowd parted slightly as another officer approached, the precinct captain. His sharp blue eyes flickered from the mayor to Reynolds, then to the people watching. He had seen enough to understand the situation immediately. The moment his gaze landed on the mayor's cheek, his jaw tightened. "Madam Mayor," he repeated, his voice more formal this time. "Are you all right?" She nodded once. "I'm fine, but that doesn't change what happened here today." The captain inhaled deeply, then turned to Reynolds, who had turned ghostly pale. "Badge, gun, now!" Reynolds blinked. "Yes, sir." "That wasn't a request," the captain said firmly. "You just put hands on a civilian, a public official, no less, with no provocation. You're done." Reynolds' hands shook as he unclipped his badge and unholstered his weapon, placing them both in the captain's waiting hand. He looked like he wanted to argue, to explain himself, but he knew there was no justification that would ever erase what he had just done, especially not with the whole city watching. The captain nodded at another officer nearby. "Escort him to the station. I'll be dealing with this personally." Reynolds didn't move right away. His gaze darted back to the mayor, and for the first time, there was something almost like fear in his eyes, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about all the times he had gotten away with it before, and those days were over. As he was led away, the mayor straightened, exhaling softly. She could still feel the sting of his hand on her face, but she wouldn't let it shake her. Instead, she turned back to the cameras, to the people who had witnessed everything. "This is why we fight," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Because if I, the mayor, can be treated this way in broad daylight, then imagine how often it happens to those without a title, without a camera, without a crowd to hold people accountable." She met the eyes of those around her. "This city belongs to all of us, and we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in cheers. The headlines would write themselves. But for the mayor, this wasn't just a moment. It was a message, and she intended to make sure it echoed for a long, long time. The energy in the crowd had shifted. The cheers were loud, but beneath them was something deeper, a reckoning. The mayor remained standing in the center of it all, shoulders squared, her presence commanding. People who had started as silent bystanders were now fully engaged, their voices joining in agreement. Some chanted her name, others simply shook their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Officer Reynolds had been led away, his expression a mixture of shock and humiliation. He had stepped into the morning believing he held power, that his uniform was a shield, that his authority could not be questioned. But now he was just another man exposed. The precinct captain remained, his posture stiff, his gaze flicking between the mayor and the press that had already started to arrive. Reporters pushed through the crowd, cameras rolling, microphones raised, hungry for a statement. The mayor held up a hand, and almost immediately, the noise settled. She wasn't just going to let this pass as another viral moment, another headline that people would forget in a week. No, this was about accountability. She took a slow breath, making sure her voice carried. What happened today was not an isolated event. It was not a mistake. It was a reflection of a system that has operated unchecked for far too long. And today we are making it clear, we will not stand for it anymore. The crowd murmured in agreement. The mayor turned slightly, locking eyes with the captain. I trust you'll be opening an immediate investigation into Officer Reynolds' past conduct? The captain hesitated for half a second before giving a firm nod. Yes, Madam Mayor. Effective immediately, she held his gaze. And I expect full transparency. Every complaint, every report that was ignored, every incident that was brushed under the rug. The people have a right to know. The captain's throat bobbed. He knew there was no escaping this moment. Not with the cameras rolling, not with the eyes of the city upon him. Another nod. Understood. The mayor didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning. She turned back to the reporters, fully aware of how this story would spread. But before she gave them their moment, she addressed the people one last time. This is not about one officer. It is not about one moment. It is about change. And change does not happen in silence. It happens when we refuse to accept the unacceptable, when we demand better, and when we hold those in power to the same laws they expect us to follow. She exhaled. Today, justice starts here. The crowd erupted again, their voices carrying through the city streets. The reporters swarmed in, but the mayor had already said what she needed to say. She turned, stepping away from the chaos, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked forward, toward her next fight, toward her next battle, toward the future she was determined to change. And for the first time in a long time, she knew the city was walking with her. The mayor stepped through the crowd with quiet determination, her presence still commanding even as the chaos of the moment swirled around her. The weight of what had just happened pressed on her shoulders, but she didn't let it slow her down. She had work to do. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She already knew what it would be. Her chief of staff, her legal advisors, members of her administration scrambling to get ahead of the media storm. But she didn't need their approval to know what needed to happen next. As she approached the steps of City Hall, her security detail flanked her, their faces tight with concern. One of them, a tall man in a dark suit, spoke quietly. Madam Mayor, you should know that reporters are waiting inside. They've already set up cameras in the main lobby. She nodded, unfazed. Let them wait. Pushing through the grand double doors, she entered the building and made a direct path toward her office. A few aides rushed to keep up with her. One of them, a young woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, held a tablet out toward her. Madam Mayor, CNN is already running the footage. Social media is exploding. There's pressure to issue an immediate statement. The mayor took the tablet, scrolling briefly through the headlines. Police officer assaults black woman, then finds out she's the mayor. She let out a slow breath. The world was watching. Good. She handed the tablet back. Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I'll be speaking directly. Her aide hesitated. Do you want us to draft something for you? No, the mayor said firmly. I know what I need to say. She pushed open the doors to her office, her mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about today. It wasn't just about her. This was about every single person who had been in her place before. The ones who didn't have cameras. The ones who didn't have an audience. The ones who had been silenced. And she would not be silent. The city deserved more than a moment of outrage. It deserved action. She turned to her chief of staff. I want a full report on the complaints filed against Officer Reynolds. And not just him. I want data on every excessive force complaint filed in the last 5 years. Her chief of staff paled slightly but nodded. I'll get our legal team on it. The mayor's jaw tightened. And I want the police chief in my office by noon. If there's going to be accountability, it starts now. Her aides scrambled into motion, leaving her alone in the quiet of her office. She finally sat down, rubbing her temples for just a moment before exhaling. She had been in politics long enough to know how easily outrage faded, how quickly people moved on. Not this time. This time, she would make sure that what happened on that sidewalk meant something. This was only the beginning, and she was just getting started. By noon, the city was at a boiling point. The footage of Officer Reynolds striking the mayor had already gone viral. News anchors debated the implications, legal analysts discussed the potential fallout, and civil rights groups were demanding immediate disciplinary action. Protesters had begun gathering outside City Hall, their voices echoing through the streets. Inside, the mayor stood at the head of a long conference table, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the police chief. The tension in the room was suffocating. You've seen the footage, she said, her voice level but sharp. The police chief, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair, nodded stiffly. Yes, Madam Mayor. She arched a brow. And he hesitated, his jaw tightening. Officer Reynolds' actions were inexcusable. The mayor leaned forward. Then why is he not already in a holding cell? A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The police commissioner, seated a few chairs down, cleared his throat. Madam Mayor, we understand your frustration, but there are procedures. She cut him off with a sharp look. Procedures? If that footage showed a civilian striking an officer, would we be talking about procedures? Or would that person already be in handcuffs? No one answered. The mayor straightened. Reynolds will be suspended immediately, pending investigation. No pay. The chief shifted uncomfortably. We can't. You will. Or I will personally ensure that this administration pushes for a full independent review of your department. A muscle in the chief's jaw twitched. Understood. The mayor turned to her chief of staff. Release a statement confirming the suspension, but also include the data we just pulled, every case of excessive force in the last 5 years. We're not just fixing this. We're fixing the system that allowed it to happen. Her staff scrambled into action, typing furiously on their laptops. The police officials sat in stunned silence. The mayor turned back to the chief. Do you have anything else to add? He exhaled through his nose. We'll cooperate with the review. Good. She gathered her notes. Because this is just the beginning. She exited the room without waiting for a response, her security detail falling into step behind her. As soon as she stepped into the hallway, an aide rushed up to her. Madam Mayor, the press conference is set for 3 p.m. The networks are already covering it live. She nodded. I'm ready. And she was, because this wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. And today, she would make sure their voices were heard. By the time 3 p.m. arrived, the city was at a standstill. The press conference was being broadcast live on every major network, and thousands had gathered outside City Hall, waiting to hear what the mayor had to say. Reporters sat poised with their microphones, their notebooks open, prepared to document every word. The mayor stood behind the podium, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding. She took a deep breath, the cameras flashing in front of her, and then she began. Today, The people of this city saw, in broad daylight, what too many have experienced behind closed doors. They saw an officer of the law abuse his power. They saw an act of violence committed against someone who was simply standing their ground. She let those words settle. They saw what Black Americans, what people of color, what marginalized communities have been saying for years, that this is not just one bad officer. It is a pattern, culture, a system that has allowed these actions to go unchecked for too long. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others calling out in agreement. Had I not been the mayor, had cameras not been rolling, had witnesses not spoken out, what would have happened? Would there have been an investigation? Would there have been outrage? Or would my name have simply become another statistic? Another excuse? Another story swept under the rug? She let the question hang in the air. This cannot continue, and under my leadership, it won't. The reporters' pens scratched across their notebooks. Officer Reynolds has been suspended without pay, pending investigation. But that is not where this ends. As of today, I am launching a full, independent review of the police department's handling of excessive force complaints. Every single complaint filed in the last 5 years will be reopened. Every ignored report will be reviewed. Every officer who has hidden behind a badge to abuse their power will be held accountable. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, people chanting her name. She lifted a hand, quieting them. This city belongs to its people, and no one is above the law. Not a criminal, not a politician, and certainly not an officer of the law who has forgotten that their duty is to serve and protect, not to harass and harm. The reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Microphones extended toward her, but she wasn't finished. This isn't just about today. This is about every single person who has ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. This is for the people who never got justice. This is for those who were told their voices didn't matter. She looked directly into the cameras. I am telling you now, your voices do matter, and I am listening. The roar of the crowd shook the steps of City Hall. The mayor stepped back from the podium, exhaling. This was only the beginning, and she was just getting started. As the crowd erupted in cheers, the mayor took a measured step back from the podium, inhaling deeply. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, but she carried it with purpose. She had spent her career fighting for justice, but today wasn't just another battle. It was the beginning of a war against a system that had gone unchecked for too long. The reporters continued shouting questions, but she didn't answer. Not yet. She had made her statement, and now it was time for the people to let it sink in. Her chief of staff leaned in, whispering, "The governor's office is on the line. They want to discuss this immediately." Of course they did. She turned slightly, signaling to her team. "Tell them I'll take their call in 20 minutes. As she stepped away from the podium, the cameras continued flashing, capturing every moment of her departure. Her security detail formed a tight perimeter around her as she moved through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding to supporters. Some reached out, desperate to share their own stories, their own experiences with police misconduct. A woman in her late 40s grasped her hand tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "My son. He didn't have cameras around when it happened to him. They covered it up. But today you made sure people saw." The mayor squeezed her hand in return, a silent promise that this wouldn't just be a moment, but a movement. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere was electric. Staff members were working at full speed, drafting follow-up statements, preparing for the inevitable political backlash, and compiling the requested files on past misconduct cases. The sheer volume of ignored complaints was staggering. Hundreds of reports buried under bureaucracy, dismissed without investigation, erased by a system built to protect itself. She clenched her jaw. Not anymore. Her office door closed behind her, sealing her in with her team. "Give me the top 5 cases that need immediate action," she ordered, sliding into her chair. "We're not waiting for this investigation to drag on for months. People need to see that we mean business." An aide handed her a folder. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. One name immediately stood out: Officer Reynolds. Her stomach twisted. The man who had slapped her in broad daylight had 5 previous complaints of excessive force. All dismissed. Her fingers tightened around the paper. I want to know who handled these reports, who signed off on the dismissals, who buried them. Another aide hesitated. Madam Mayor, this could expose a lot of high-ranking officials. She lifted her gaze, her voice firm. Good. Let's expose them. The room fell into a hushed silence before her chief of staff nodded. I'll have the names on your desk within the hour. A knock on the door interrupted them. A security officer stepped in, his expression unreadable. Madam Mayor, the police union just released a statement. They're pushing back hard. Of course they were. She exhaled, standing. Send it to my office. And get me a meeting with the governor. The walls were closing in on the old system, and they knew it. But she wasn't afraid, because this time justice wasn't going to be silenced. The statement from the police union landed on her desk within minutes. The words were predictable, a carefully crafted mix of denial, deflection, and damage control. They framed Officer Reynolds as an unfairly targeted officer, painting the mayor's actions as a political stunt rather than a response to blatant misconduct. She scoffed. They were scrambling. Her chief of staff placed another file in front of her. The governor's office wants to schedule a call. They're getting pressure from their donors, especially from law enforcement groups. They want you to reconsider the independent review. The mayor looked up, her expression unreadable. Reconsider? Her chief of staff hesitated. They're concerned about the optics. The mayor let out a slow breath, setting the union's statement aside. Optics, that was all it ever was to them. She stood, adjusting her blazer. Schedule the call. But I'm not here to negotiate justice. Her team nodded, already working on securing the meeting. Just as she turned back to the reports, her office phone rang. Not her direct line, her emergency line. The one only a handful of people had access to. She exchanged a glance with her security detail before answering. This is the mayor. A deep voice came through the line. Madam Mayor, this is U.S. Attorney William Carter. We need to talk. She stiffened. Federal involvement? Already? I'm listening. We saw the footage. I have my team reviewing it now. But more importantly, we've been conducting an ongoing investigation into civil rights violations within your police department. She sat down slowly. How long has this been going on? Over a year. But today's events have escalated things. He hesitated before adding, I need to know if you're willing to cooperate. Her grip on the phone tightened. I don't just want to cooperate. I want in. A beat of silence. Then a small chuckle. I had a feeling you'd say that. She leaned forward, her mind already spinning. What do you need from me? For now, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Push the review. Bring everything into the light. The more transparency you create, the harder it will be for them to cover their tracks. The mayor nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll do more than that. She could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Then let's bring the house down together. As the call ended, she set the phone down. Her pulse steady, but her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about a single corrupt officer anymore. This was bigger, and she was ready for war. The mayor sat in silence for a moment after the call ended, the weight of the moment pressing against her. A federal investigation. This wasn't just about Officer Reynolds anymore. It was about an entire system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. And now, with the eyes of the Justice Department on them, there would be no more hiding. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from her communications director. You need to see this. She clicked on the link and a video popped up. A new angle of the incident. Someone had recorded the entire exchange from the side, capturing the exact moment Officer Reynolds' hand struck her face. But it wasn't just the slap. It was the smirk that followed. The satisfied little twitch of his lips before realization dawned on him. Her stomach twisted. He had enjoyed it. The media had already begun dissecting the footage, playing it on repeat, amplifying every detail. It wasn't just an act of aggression. It was a display of power. A power he had assumed would go unchallenged. The mayor exhaled sharply. Not this time. She rose from her chair, stepping into the hallway where her team was waiting. Has the governor's office called back? Her chief of staff nodded. They're on the line now. Good, she said, adjusting her sleeves as she strode toward the conference room. Because we need to have a very serious conversation. Inside, the call was already connected. The governor's voice came through the speaker, laced with forced neutrality. Madam Mayor, I wanted to personally reach out. I know tensions are high, and I wanted to discuss a path forward that ensures stability. She smirked, already recognizing the subtext. Stability. Translation, back off. I appreciate the call, Governor, she said, her voice smooth but firm. But stability should never come at the cost of justice. And I won't be backing down from the review. In fact, we're expanding it. Silence. Then, a shift in tone. Madam Mayor, these things take time. We don't want to create unnecessary division in our law enforcement community. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. With all due respect, Governor, that division already exists. The only difference now is that people are finally watching. Another long pause. The governor sighed. You know this is going to make enemies for you. She glanced at the phones, the screens, the reports piling on her desk. She thought of every victim whose story had been buried, and she made peace with what had to be done. Then let them come. She ended the call, because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every single person who had been silenced before her, and she wasn't afraid. The moment the call ended, the mayor leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The battle lines had been drawn. She knew exactly what was coming next. Political pushback, threats, attempts to discredit her. They would paint her as radical, accuse her of creating division, and frame her pursuit of justice as an attack on law enforcement itself. She had seen it before, but this time she was ready. Her chief of staff stepped into the room. The public is behind you. Polls are showing overwhelming support for the review, and the footage is dominating national headlines. But law enforcement unions are already putting pressure on the state government. She nodded, expecting as much. Let them. They don't get to decide how accountability works. Her security officer entered next, his expression unreadable. Madam Mayor, you have a visitor. She arched a brow. Who? Commissioner Ellis. Silence. The police commissioner himself. She straightened, motioning for him to be brought in. A moment later, a tall, grizzled man in a dark suit entered, his face carefully neutral. He looked at her, then at the staff still present. We need to talk, he said. She studied him for a long moment. About what? He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, about the real problem in the department. A flicker of interest sparked in her eyes. She gestured for her staff to leave. When the door closed, she folded her hands on the table. Go on, he exhaled. I'm not here to defend Reynolds. What he did was indefensible. But he's not the worst of them. She narrowed her gaze. Then who is? Ellis hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he slid a thick folder across the desk. She opened it. Inside was a list, dozens of names. Officers with excessive force complaints, internal affairs investigations, cover-ups spanning years. Her pulse quickened. This, he said, tapping the file, is your real fight. And if you go through with this review, they're gonna come after you with everything they have. She closed the folder slowly, meeting his gaze. Let them. The commissioner exhaled, shaking his head. You don't understand. These aren't just bad cops, they have powerful allies. Politicians, wealthy donors. They will try to ruin you. She smirked. Then they'll have to try harder. The commissioner studied her for a long moment, then chuckled, almost impressed. Well, he said, standing. In that case, I'll see you on the battlefield. As he walked out, the mayor opened the folder again, her eyes scanning the list. She had started this fight with one corrupt officer. Now, she was about to take down an entire system, and she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Because justice wasn't negotiable. The mayor sat alone in her office, the weight of the file in front of her pressing down like a stone. She flipped through the pages, her breath steady, her mind already working through the next steps. This was bigger than she had imagined. What had started as a singular act of misconduct, a slap in broad daylight, had unraveled into something deeper, darker, and far more entrenched. A web of officers with long histories of abuse, covered up by a network of officials who had turned a blind eye for years. And now it was in her hands. Her phone buzzed. A message from the U.S. attorney. Saw the list. This is bigger than local politics. We're expanding the federal investigation. Keep pushing on your end. She let out a slow breath. It was happening. The same city that had protected men like Officer Reynolds was now watching its walls crack. She pushed back from her desk, standing, rolling her shoulders. She had work to do. By tomorrow morning, her office would begin publicly releasing select findings. Key cases that had been buried, officers whose files had been wiped clean despite multiple reports of excessive force. She would call for state intervention, for policy changes, for independent oversight of the department. And she would make sure that the people of her city knew the truth. A knock at her door. Her chief of staff stepped inside, his expression both tense and determined. "Madam Mayor," he said, "are you ready?" She glanced at the city skyline through her window, the lights flickering like a pulse. The fight ahead would be brutal. They would come for her. They would dig into her past, twist her words, try to break her. But she wasn't afraid. She turned, smoothing her blazer, and met his gaze. "I was born ready." She strode out of the office, her footsteps steady, her head held high, and outside, the city braced for a reckoning.